asserting central influence and opening diagonals for queen and bishop, immediately sets the game's tone. Mirroring white's central occupation immediately sets up a dynamic battle for space and potential tactical fireworks. Developing this knight now claims central influence and prepares for castling, applying immediate pressure to black's pawn. Developing the knight to its natural square now contests the central pawn and prepares to castle, a solid and fundamental response. Developing the bishop to the active square eyes the f7 pawn and prepares castling, initiating typical Italian game pressures. Striking at the center and developing a piece simultaneously, black initiates a bold counterattack, directly challenging white's central pawn. Unleashing a central pawn thrust aggressively challenges black's solid development and aims to fracture their pawn structure. Accepting the pawn sacrifice immediately opens lines, creating sharp tactical possibilities and forcing quick calculation. Securing the king's safety now allows white to prepare for a central initiative and potentially open lines against black's uncastled monarch. Fortifying the pawn chain here opens lines for black's bishop, but also creates potential weaknesses on the dark squares around the king. Reclaiming the pawn with the knight immediately puts pressure on black's central pawn and opens the d-file, a crucial avenue for future piece development and potential king attacks. This aggressive posture aims to disrupt black's harmony and seize the initiative. Developing the bishop to d7 initiates a subtle defensive maneuver, preparing to connect the rooks and shield the king further. This placement also eyes the e6 square, potentially reinforcing that pawn in the future. Observe how this seemingly passive piece repositions itself to contribute to the overall harmony of black's forces. Reinforcing the knight's presence in the center and preparing further central expansion, this move signals a clear intention to pressure black's defenses and potentially open lines for attack. Developing the bishop here, aiming for kingside castling, is a natural step, but it cedes some central influence and delays grappling with white's knight on d4. Consider how this piece placement might affect future king safety and how it interacts with the e5 pawn. Preparing to fianchetto the bishop to b2 promises to control the long diagonal and support the central pawn structure, but it might slightly neglect the kingside and open up the possibility of a5 for black. Finally, bringing the king to safety establishes a secure base, allowing development to continue and freeing up the rook on the h8 square for future action along the semi-open file should it arise. Preparing to eye the kingside through the newly opened diagonal, the bishop retreats, keeping an active post while avoiding immediate confrontation and bolstering the d4 knight's protection. Reclaiming the central squares, that rook now prepares a potential infiltration along the open e-file, threatening to disrupt white's carefully constructed pawn structure and challenging the bishop's diagonal influence. A purposeful shift to connect the rooks and prepare for potential pawn breaks on the kingside, while also defending the queenside pawn structure, setting the stage for a battle of positional maneuvering. Introducing the knight to e5 exerts immediate pressure on white's central pawn structure and prepares for potential breakthroughs, while simultaneously securing a central outpost for black's cavalry. A necessary step to solidify the queenside, 11. b2 repositions the bishop from its somewhat exposed diagonal, preparing to connect the rooks and potentially support a kingside pawn advance or central expansion later on. It's a subtle but important preparatory maneuver that acknowledges the ongoing positional struggle, aiming to improve the coordination of white's pieces while keeping options open. Solidifying the pawn chain, 11. c6 aims to create a robust defensive structure for black's central pawns, preparing for potential pawn pushes like d5 to gain central space or to support the knight on e5, preventing white's nc3b5 or nc3a4 maneuvers. This move also subtly prepares to open the c-file for the rook, adding another dimension to black's attacking possibilities on the queenside later in the game. Launching an aggressive pawn thrust, white boldly contests the d4 square and aims to disrupt black's comfortable central structure, potentially opening lines towards the kingside for attacking opportunities. The knight, having found itself somewhat hemmed in by white's advancing pawn storm on the kingside, seeks a more active square, This maneuver aims to reposition the knight towards the kingside defense, specifically by eyeing the h4 square, potentially disrupting white's aggressive intentions and offering defensive support to the beleaguered black king. It's a subtle shift from a more passive position to one with greater potential for counterplay, even if it doesn't immediately offer a concrete tactical threat. Opening the e-file aims to activate your rook and potentially pressure black's central pawn structure or open lines towards the king if black is not careful with their pawn advances. Black retreats the bishop to f8, a rather passive maneuver that seems to relinquish the initiative after white's active rook placement on the e-file. This decision may be an attempt to safeguard the king, but it sacrifices valuable tempo and cedes control of the central diagonal to white's pieces. Consider the long-term implications of such defensive postures. It allows white to build pressure unimpeded and potentially restrict black's piece mobility for the remainder of the game. Shifting the bishop from b2 to d3 allows white to support the central pawn push f5, aiming to gain more space on the kingside and potentially open lines against black's king. This also subtly improves the bishop's scope, pointing towards the queenside, and prepares for a possible knight maneuver to e4. Black asserts pressure on the queenside pawns, specifically targeting the b3 pawn and indirectly influencing white's central control, a bold assertion of queenside counterplay in response to white's centralized pieces and active development. Sensing an opportunity, white attempts to pry open the queenside. The knight's jump to the rim, though seemingly passive, aims to disrupt black's queenside structure and potentially exchange for the bishop on b7 should it decide to challenge the center's pawn tension. This maneuver also opens a path for the c-pawn, hinting at a queenside expansion, while carefully keeping an eye on black's central forces that might try to regroup. Black consolidates the queen's position, preparing for potential activity on the queenside while also offering a subtle retreat should white's knights prove too aggressive on the c-file. Rerouting the knight to its starting square feels like a strategic retreat, perhaps to defend the central pawn structure which might have been subtly weakened by white's earlier commitment of the f-pawn, or to prepare a potential regrouping on the kingside, aiming to contest control of the e-file indirectly. Reclaiming the vital diagonal for the bishop solidifies black's queenside structure and prepares for potential pawn advances, though it does allow white's knight to redeploy more actively to the center. Liberating the c-pawn opens lines for the queen and bishop, proactively challenging black's somewhat passive piece placement. Black boldly challenges the center, aiming to dismantle white's pawn structure and inject life into the queenside attack, potentially opening lines for the rooks and bishop. Shattering the center, white seizes an opportunity to dismantle black's pawn structure and open lines for immediate activity. This aggressive advance, sacrificing a pawn for dynamic compensation, aims to disrupt black's harmonious development and exploit any lingering weaknesses in their king's defenses. Opening up the c-file with this pawn thrust instantly injects dynamism, forcing white to reevaluate their central control and potentially exposing the queenside. While it creates immediate complications, securing active piece play, the underlying question is whether black can effectively harness this newfound activity before white's kingside buildup begins to tell. This aggressive expansion demands precise calculation to avoid overextending and leaving weaknesses. Shifting the knight from its previous outpost signals a reassessment of black's kingside pressure, aiming to redeploy the piece to a more active square, perhaps on d5 or e4, to contest central squares or support an attack. A preemptive counter to white's queenside expansion, seeking to limit the bishop's scope and potentially prepare a pawn storm. A quiet repositioning, subtly aiming to unblock the f-file for potential future operations, while simultaneously offering the king a safer haven, anticipating any immediate tactical fireworks black might be preparing on the queenside. Black repositions the queen, preparing to contest the open d-file and potentially support a pawn push on the queenside. Unleashing the central pawn is a bold declaration, aiming to shatter black's defensive setup and pry open the position for white's pieces to exploit. This aggressive thrust immediately challenges the e5 pawn, creating a dynamic imbalance and forcing black to make a critical decision about how to react to this sudden surge of activity. The potential for tactical fireworks is palpable as lines begin to crack. Black immediately challenges the pawn push, aiming to dismantle White's central influence and open lines that could potentially benefit Black's pieces. This exchange sacrifices a tempo in development, but crucially prevents White from establishing a dominant pawn center and opens the d-file for potential Black counterplay. The question now is whether Black can effectively utilize the released diagonals and files before White reorganizes and capitalizes on the advanced e-pawn's potential. Reclaiming the central pawn presents an immediate opportunity to challenge Black's advanced pieces and open lines for White's pieces. The pawn push generates crucial spatial pressure along the e-file, potentially forcing Black into defensive maneuvers and disrupting their piece harmony. This aggressive pawn recapture actively fights for control of the center and signals White's intent to dictate the tempo of the game. Unleashing the advanced pawn structure, Black pushes to conquer more central territory and create queenside space, disrupting White's piece coordination and potentially opening lines for active play. Unleashing a pawn storm on the queenside, White initiates a fascinating positional gambit, seeking to destabilize Black's pawn structure and open lines for their own pieces. This bold pawn sacrifice, while seemingly weakening White's central control, aims to disrupt Black's queenside harmony and potentially create attacking avenues. Observe how the newly opened diagonal for the g2 bishop and the potential pressure along the f-file are now significant considerations. Black must now carefully evaluate if the material gain is worth the potential positional concessions and the increased activity White might achieve. A desperate gambit to disrupt White's attacking structure. By sacrificing the bishop, Black aims to shatter the central pawn chain and open lines for counterplay, hoping the resulting pawn chaos will distract from White's king's safety concerns. This move fundamentally alters the game's character, transforming it into a sharp, tactical slugfest where precise calculation and aggressive pawn play will be paramount. The bishop returns to a central outpost, now eyeing the exposed Black king and preparing to join the attack on the queenside if opportunities arise. Shattering the pawn shield around White's monarch, this capture aims to expose the king's defenses and activate the g-file for immediate pressure, though it leaves Black's own king dangerously open. Initiating a fierce knight assault, the White knight re-enters the fray, targeting Black's weakened queenside pawn structure, and simultaneously preparing to exploit the open kingside files. Rad immediately contests the open d-file, a crucial artery that White's nd4 currently occupies. This pawn structure, fractured by the exchanges, suggests Black wants to leverage open lines for piece activity. The goal is to dislodge White's knight, which, while centralized, now lacks robust pawn support and could become a target if Black can coordinate their rooks effectively. Consider how Black's other rook on e8 might join the fray, creating doubled pressure. Unlocking the e-file presents an immediate opportunity, forcing Black to confront the potential for White's queen to infiltrate while simultaneously addressing the exposed pawn structure. Unleashing the queen to patrol the a7-g1 diagonal, this maneuver aims to pierce White's central structure and apply pressure, a bold bid for counterplay that opens lines for aggressive action. A calculated gambit to reclaim piece initiative, forcing a confrontation for the crucial central squares and challenging Black's rather static piece development. Reigniting the central fight, this knight's daring sortie to e5 challenges White's pawn structure and aims to disrupt the harmony of Black's pieces, potentially opening lines towards the weakened kingside. Re-establishing knight presence on a central square signals a shift towards consolidating White's pieces and preparing for potential pawn pushes or further piece maneuvering, aiming to exploit the slightly less harmonious placement of Black's knight on e5. Challenging the central pawn structure while simultaneously preparing to activate the light-squared bishop. Sacrificing the bishop creates a shattered kingside pawn structure for Black, leaving the king exposed and potentially opening lines for White's attack. Opening a diagonal for the queen and unlocking the f-file, this pawn sacrifice aims to create immediate threats and disrupt White's pawn structure, a bold bid to seize the initiative. Unlocking a sudden kingside attack, this knight maneuver aims to exploit the weakened pawn structure around Black's king and the open diagonals. This move boldly throws open the central pawn structure, aiming to create immediate counterplay by disrupting White's established piece coordination. Black is gambling that the resulting pawn weaknesses won't be fatal, instead prioritizing an active piece deployment and the potential to harass the white king. It's a dynamic choice that prioritizes initiative over immediate material or structural solidity, a true test of the ensuing tactical melee. The king is suddenly exposed, a tantalizing target now that the e-file is cleared, forcing an immediate defensive decision. Protecting your monarch becomes paramount. The discovered attack on your king demands immediate attention, and repositioning to the G7 square offers a necessary escape route, creating a safer haven for your king while keeping an eye on potential threats developing from white's active pieces. Gaining a tempo with the knight's swift retreat to F7 aims to dislodge the disruptive black knight and open diagonals, creating potential havoc around the isolated black king. The black queen reclaims the queenside, initiating a complex battle for control of the open files and aiming to reposition for a potential counterattack against the exposed white king. Opening the queen to the kingside flank, this repositioning aims to create attacking potential against black's castled king, utilizing the newly cleared diagonal and eyeing potential sacrifices. Defending against the immediate attack on the king necessitates a pragmatic, though perhaps slightly passive, approach, effectively locking down the G7 square and preventing further penetration. Unleashing the queen to the queenside targets the weakened structure around black's king, exploiting the open files and the misplaced knight. Relinquishing the H-file allows white's queen an even more menacing entry point, a crucial decision that may cost black dearly in the long run. Unleashing a knight into the black king's defensive camp disrupts their carefully constructed pawn shield, aiming to exploit the exposed position of black's monarch and create immediate tactical threats. Initiating a desperate defense, black recaptures the bishop, aiming to stabilize the shattered pawn structure and regain some material equality, though the king's exposed position remains a grave concern. Unleashing a decisive discovered attack, this check forces the black king from its protective shield, ripping open lines for white's powerful queen and knight battery. The black king, exposed on the G-file and facing a battery of white pieces, seeks a desperate escape route, abandoning its central defense in a gamble for survival. Unleashing a discovered attack on the enemy monarch, this move forces a decisive confrontation by exposing the black king and leveraging the battery on the B2 G7 diagonal. The monarch flees the discovered attack, seeking refuge from the looming knight, but the unleashed bishop on the long diagonal presents a dire threat, forcing a desperate retreat to a slightly safer square amidst the chaos. Unleashing the rook along the open file, white aggressively targets the weakened black king, creating immediate tactical fireworks and forcing a critical defensive decision. A desperate attempt to consolidate the crumbling defensive structure, aiming to block the devastating open files and perhaps create some breathing room for the beleaguered monarch. Unleashing a powerful assault by activating the queen, white aims to exploit the exposed black king and create mating threats, aiming to pierce through the weakened defensive structure after the exchange of pawns and knights.